Alexander Reed stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring out over the city lights that stretched endlessly beneath him. The hum of the city, the pulse of business, and the power that came with his position as a billionaire CEO were all there, but they didn't fill the emptiness inside. No matter how much money he made, no matter how many deals he closed, the hollow feeling never seemed to go away. He had it all, yet nothing. It was a feeling that had gnawed at him for years, and no matter how many luxury cars he owned or how many properties he could claim, it never truly satisfied the ache in his heart. He wasn't alone, but he was lonely, trapped in a world where every relationship felt like an arrangement, a deal, a transaction. No one saw the real him, and he was too afraid to show them. That's when he decided to take a break. A simple walk in the fresh air, away from the constant buzz of the corporate world. The next day, he found himself wandering through the local farmer's market, drawn by the scent of fresh strawberries that seemed to call to him amidst the chaotic blur of produce stands. As he walked closer, he saw her, a woman standing behind a small table, her hands moving gracefully as she arranged baskets of strawberries. Her smile was radiant, the kind of smile that seemed to light up the entire space around her. Sophie. She didn't notice him at first, but Alexander couldn't look away. There was something about her that pulled him in, something real, something genuine. It was a stark contrast to the polished world he lived in, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt something he hadn't known he'd been missing: warmth. Sophie looked up, her eyes meeting his. Her gaze was soft, but it held a certain strength. Like she had seen the world in ways most people couldn't imagine, yet she still had the ability to care. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice carrying the same warmth as her smile. He hesitated for a moment before responding, his usual confidence faltering just a little. I've never had strawberries like this before." She chuckled softly, the sound like a melody. "Well, these are special. Locally grown. You can taste the difference." Her words were simple, yet they made something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was seeing the world through fresh eyes, through hers. There was no pretension, no mask, just her and the strawberries. As he bought a basket, their conversation drifted to more personal topics. Sophie spoke of her life, her son Danny, and the challenges of raising him as a single mother. There was no bitterness in her words, only strength and love. She had been through a lot: betrayal, heartache, and loneliness. But there was a resilience to her that inspired Alexander in ways he couldn't explain. "Danny's my world," Sophie said, her eyes softening as she spoke of her son. "I'd do it all for him." Alexander nodded, understanding more than he let on. He was no stranger to sacrificing personal happiness for the sake of others, but hearing it from her made him realize just how far he had drifted from the things that truly mattered. He walked away from the market that day with more than just strawberries. He carried a feeling, a realization, that his life was about to change in ways he hadn't expected. Little did he know, Sophie would soon become the most important person in his life. A woman who, despite everything she had been through, had the ability to show him what it meant to truly live, to truly love. And though he hadn't yet realized it, she was about to turn his world upside down. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself returning to the farmer's market. At first, it was just for the strawberries, a small excuse to see her again. But soon, it became about more than just a fruit. It was Sophie. The way she spoke, the way she cared for Danny, her laughter that seemed to resonate deep within him. Each time he saw her, that void inside him seemed to shrink just a little more. One afternoon, as he approached her stall, he noticed Danny running towards him, a big grin plastered across the boy's face. "Hi," Danny called out, his excitement infectious. "I remember you. You bought strawberries last time. Can I help you pick some today?" Alexander smiled, crouching down to Danny's level. "Sure, I'd love your help." Danny handed him a basket and showed him the ripest, juiciest strawberries. There was something about the boy's innocence, his untainted joy, that pulled at Alexander's heart. He had grown up with everything he could ever want, but Danny had something real, something pure that Alexander couldn't remember feeling in years. As they picked strawberries together, Sophie joined them, her hands full of fresh produce. She watched them, her smile soft and proud as Danny interacted with Alexander, making jokes, pointing out the best fruit. "You're good with him," Sophie said, her voice filled with a quiet warmth. Alexander shrugged, unsure of how to respond. "He's easy to talk to. Kids have a way of making everything seem simpler." She nodded. "They do, don't they?" It was then that Alexander realized that Sophie had been through more than he could ever imagine. Her strength wasn't just in her ability to raise Danny alone. It was in her ability to keep moving forward despite everything life had thrown her way. Their conversations grew deeper, revealing fragments of their lives that they had both buried. Sophie spoke of her past, of the man she had once loved, Elliot, a man who had promised her the world, but had turned out to be nothing but a betrayal, leaving her to raise Danny on her own. The scars were still there, not visible to the eye, but present in the way Sophie spoke of trust. Alexander listened, not as a CEO or a businessman, but as a man who understood loneliness and loss. He had his own demons, his own fears of trusting anyone, and hearing Sophie's story resonated with him on a level he hadn't expected. "I don't know if I can trust again," Sophie admitted one evening as they sat on a bench near the market, the sun setting behind them. "It's not just about me anymore. It's Danny. I don't want him to see me hurt again." Alexander's heart tightened at her words. He could feel the weight of her vulnerability, the fear that she might never truly let herself be loved again. And he understood it, but he also knew that sometimes letting someone in was the only way to truly heal. "I understand," he said quietly, "but sometimes trust isn't about never getting hurt. It's about finding someone who will be there when you do." Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. For a moment, there was silence, heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. Then, out of nowhere, Elliot appeared. He was standing by the market entrance, watching them. His eyes darkened as they met Sophie's. There was a tension in the air, a quiet threat hanging over them. "What are you doing here?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling slightly as she stood up. Elliot's eyes flicked to Alexander, then back to her. "I came to talk. You know, about Danny." Sophie stepped in front of Alexander, her protective instincts kicking in. "There's nothing to talk about. You had your chance." Alexander could see the fear in Sophie's eyes, the fear that Elliot would somehow drag her back into the past, into the pain she had worked so hard to escape. But Alexander wasn't about to let that happen. He stood up slowly, his presence firm, his voice calm but unwavering. "You're not welcome here," he said to Elliot, his tone carrying authority that made the other man hesitate. "Sophie and Danny don't need you anymore." For a moment, Elliot's eyes burned with anger, but Alexander didn't back down. He was standing between Sophie and the man who had hurt her, and in that moment, it wasn't just about defending her. It was about proving to her that she wasn't alone anymore, that he was there, and he would always protect her. Elliot scowled, then turned and walked away, his departure leaving an uneasy silence behind. Sophie looked at Alexander, her expression soft but conflicted. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Alexander replied. "You and Danny deserve more than what he's willing to give." And for the first time, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could truly offer her the kind of love and protection she had always dreamed of. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of hope, a kind of quiet, steady optimism that began to bloom in Sophie's heart. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something more than just survival. She started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could open her heart again. Alexander, too, felt a shift inside him. He had spent his life building walls around his emotions, but with Sophie, it was different. She didn't expect him to be perfect, to have it all together. She just wanted him to be real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be. Their connection deepened, not just through shared conversations, but through simple moments, watching Danny play in the park, laughing over a shared meal, or just sitting together in silence, comfortable in each other's presence. It was in these quiet moments that Alexander realized how much he had been missing. One evening, as they sat together on Sophie's modest porch, the sound of crickets filling the air, Sophie turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "I never thought I could trust someone again, not after everything." Alexander reached out and gently took her hand, his voice soft but steady. "I know it's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone. I'm here." There was a long pause as Sophie searched his face, her mind clearly weighing the decision to fully let go of her past and embrace the future with him. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the promise of a love that wasn't tainted by the disappointments of the past. "You make it hard to stay guarded," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander smiled, a warmth spreading in his chest. "Good. I want to make it hard." It was then that Danny ran up to them, his face flushed from playing outside. "Hey, are we going to park tomorrow? Can we go to the swings again?" Sophie laughed, ruffling Danny's hair. "We'll see, buddy. But you're getting awfully good at those swings." Alexander chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "I think Danny might be teaching us a thing or two about enjoying life." Sophie smiled, her heart swelling with affection. Watching them together, seeing the way Alexander cared for her son, she realized just how much her life had changed. She had never imagined a future like this, one filled with laughter, support, and a love that seemed to grow deeper with every passing day. But as much as she wanted to believe in this new chapter, the shadows of her past still lingered. One evening, Sophie found herself staring at the door, wondering if it was time to have the conversation she had been avoiding, the one about her past with Elliot, the one that had shaped so much of her hesitation toward trusting Alexander completely. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to share the truth, to let him in even more, to allow him to understand the depth of her fears and the scars she carried. It was one thing to be vulnerable, but it was another to open up about the pain she had tried so hard to bury. That night, as they sat together, Alexander sensing her unease, he gently reached out to her, his voice soft. "What's on your mind, Sophie?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the cup of tea in her hands. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been afraid to share." Alexander gave her a reassuring smile, his eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, Sophie, but I'm here for you, always." Sophie exhaled slowly, her heart racing as she spoke. "It's about Elliot. He wasn't just someone I loved. He was someone who destroyed me. I was young, naive, and he made me believe in a future that didn't exist. When everything fell apart, I was left with nothing but the pieces of my broken heart. And Danny, he was the only thing that kept me going." Alexander listened intently, his gaze never leaving her. He could hear the pain in her voice, the way her past still haunted her, and he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of protectiveness toward her. "I didn't want to bring it up because I was afraid you'd think I was still holding on to the past," Sophie continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But I need you to know. I need you to understand why I am the way I am sometimes." Alexander reached over and gently cupped her face, his touch tender and reassuring. "Sophie, you don't have to carry that burden alone anymore. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, they just sat there, holding each other in silence. It was in this quiet moment that Sophie realized how much she had already healed, how much she had already grown. And it was because of Alexander. She wasn't just a mother. She wasn't just someone scarred by the past. She was Sophie, a woman who had the strength to love again, to trust again, and to build a future she had never thought possible. The next day, after their conversation, Alexander took Sophie and Danny to the park. It wasn't just an ordinary outing. It was a symbol of the future they were building together. And as they all laughed, running around and enjoying each other's company, Alexander felt a surge of emotion wash over him. This was what he had been searching for. This was what he had been missing. A family, a connection, a love that would transform his life forever. And in that moment, as he looked at Sophie and Danny, he knew he would do whatever it took to protect them, to build a life filled with the kind of love and happiness that Sophie had always deserved. As the weeks passed, Alexander and Sophie's relationship blossomed into something neither of them had expected. They became a team, supporting each other, sharing their dreams, and building a life together that was stronger than any of the fears that had once held them back. Every moment with Sophie and Danny filled Alexander with a sense of purpose he had never known, a purpose that went beyond the cold ambitions of the corporate world. Danny, too, began to see Alexander not just as Sophie's boyfriend, but as a part of their family. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, Danny turned to Alexander with wide eyes and asked, "Are you going to be my dad now?" Sophie froze, unsure of how Alexander would respond, but Alexander didn't hesitate. He smiled softly, kneeling down to Danny's level. "I don't think I could ever replace your dad, buddy," he said gently, "but I'd be honored to be a part of your life, and I'll always be here for you." Danny grinned, his small hands reaching for Alexander's, and that simple gesture meant more to Sophie than words could express. It was a moment of acceptance, of family, and Sophie felt a surge of gratitude for how far they had come together. But as perfect as their life seemed, there was still the matter of Sophie's past, the lingering shadows of betrayal that had once kept her from fully embracing her happiness. She had kept her distance from Alexander's world, hesitant to introduce him to her old life, to her family. But as Christmas approached, Sophie knew it was time. Time to fully open her heart. Time to show Alexander who she truly was. Broken, strong, vulnerable, but also full of hope. It was a week before Christmas when Alexander took the bold step. He had always known he wanted to spend his life with Sophie, but he hadn't known how or when to ask. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the season, he knew. One evening, after a family dinner filled with laughter and the soft glow of Christmas lights, Alexander turned to Sophie. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion, "I've never known love like this before. And I know we've both been through so much, but I can't imagine my life without you in it. I don't just want to be a part of your life. I want to build a future with you, with Danny. I want to be the man who stands by you through everything." Sophie's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing as she looked at him, unsure of what to say. She had always been afraid to trust, to believe that someone could love her unconditionally. But looking into Alexander's eyes, she saw a love that was unwavering, a love that had grown in ways she had never imagined. Before she could speak, Alexander reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Sophie, will you marry me? Will you let me build this life with you, with Danny?" Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked at him, her heart overflowing with emotions she could no longer hold back. She had never imagined that she could feel this kind of love again, never imagined that she could find someone who would not only accept her past, but embrace her future. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, I will." In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their little home and the love they had built, Alexander and Sophie knew that they had found something rare and beautiful, a love that had healed them both, a love that would carry them through anything life could throw their way. As Christmas Eve arrived, they stood together in front of their little tree, Danny's laughter filling the air as he ran around in excitement. Alexander and Sophie exchanged a look, a shared understanding of how far they had come, how much they had grown together. This wasn't just a beginning. It was a promise. They weren't perfect. They didn't have it all figured out, but they had each other. And in that moment, they knew that no matter what, that was enough. And so, with the soft hum of Christmas carols in the background and the warmth of a new future ahead of them, Alexander, Sophie, and Danny stepped into the next chapter of their lives, together.